Lyndon B. Johnson, frequently called LBJ, was an American politician and moderate Democrat who was President of the United States from 1963 to 1969. He was born on August 27, 1908, and died on January 22, 1973. Lyndon B. Johnson was elected Vice President of the United States alongside President John F. Kennedy in 1960 and acceded to the presidency upon Kennedy's assassination in 1963. He was president from 1963 to 1969. By 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson knew he was unlikely to win another presidential election. His increase of American involvement in the Vietnam War, as well as rising American casualties in Vietnam, had made him deeply unpopular. After Senator Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy declared their candidacies for the Democratic presidential nomination, Johnson announced that he would not seek another term and would, instead, retire. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. The event thrust Lyndon Johnson into the presidency. A man widely considered to be one of the most expert and brilliant politicians of his time, Johnson would leave office a little more than 5 years later as one of the least popular presidents in American history. The man who had risen from the poor hill country of Texas to become the acknowledged leader of the United States Senate and occupant of the Oval Office would return to Texas demoralized and discredited. He died 4 years later, a few hundred feet from the place of his birth. That year, however, belonged to John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Young, handsome, rich, and witty, the senator from Massachusetts piled up one primary win after another. Despite Johnson's announcement of his own candidacy, Kennedy was nominated on the first ballot at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. Facing a seasoned Republican contender in Vice President Richard Nixon, Kennedy turned to Johnson to bring political and geographical balance to the ticket. Johnson delivered the South, including several states that had voted Republican during the Eisenhower years, and the team of JFK and LBJ won the election by the smallest popular margin of the century. Although Johnson never seemed comfortable in the vice presidency, he headed the space program, oversaw a nuclear test ban treaty, and worked toward equal opportunity for members of racial minorities. He also publicly supported the young president's decision to send American military advisors to the Southeast Asian country of Vietnam, whose corrupt but friendly government was threatened by a communist insurgency. Johnson was not, however, in Kennedy's inner circle and seemed frustrated by his lack of influence, particularly on legislative matters. Johnson was only 2 cars behind Kennedy on the day the president was shot to death in Dallas. He was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One later that afternoon. A few days later, he spoke to a joint session of Congress. Seizing on Kennedy's inaugural plea to let us begin anew, he asked Congress to let us continue. Over the next year, he endorsed the late president's programs even as he announced his own. He pushed for passage of Kennedy's Tax Cut and Civil Rights Bill and declared a war on poverty. When he ran for election against the Republican conservative Barry Goldwater in late 1964, he won by the biggest popular vote margin in history. During his presidency, Johnson engineered the passage of the Medicare program, poured money into education and reconstruction of the cities, and pushed through 3 civil rights bills that outlawed discrimination against minorities in the areas of accommodations in interstate commerce, voting, and housing. But in the meantime, the conflict in Vietnam was intensifying. By 1965, the American advisors were a thing of the past as Johnson began an escalation of American commitment to more than 100,000 combat troops. Within 3 years, the number would swell to more than 500,000. As American casualties increased, an anti-war movement gathered momentum. The North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front kept winning, even as Johnson poured more money, firepower, and men into the war effort. Ultimately, the president came to be identified personally with a war that seemed unwinnable. As a result, his popularity sagged drastically, dipping below 30% in approval ratings. Senator Eugene McCarthy, a Minnesota Democrat, announced that he would seek the Democratic nomination and did surprisingly well in the New Hampshire primary. President Kennedy's younger brother Robert also joined the race. On March 31, 1968, Johnson announced that he would neither seek nor accept the nomination. After a relatively short period in restless retirement, Lyndon Johnson died on January 22, 1973. His grave lies in a stand of live oaks along the Pedernales River at the LBJ Ranch. Johnson's presidency began and ended with tragedy. He came into office after the death of a popular young president and provided needed continuity and stability. He advanced the Kennedy legacy, obtaining far more than Kennedy would likely have gotten out of Congress, and then won a huge landslide victory for himself and his party. Johnson's administration passed an unprecedented amount of legislation, with much of it designed to protect the nation's land, air, water, wilderness, and quality of life to keep Americans safer and the United States from becoming uglier and dirtier. President Johnson's administration also extended the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt, including aid to education, Head Start, Medicare, and Medicaid programs that are still significant today and that command bipartisan support for their effectiveness. But many of his initiatives for the arts, for the environment, for poverty, for racial justice, and for workplace safety angered many economic and social conservatives and became the targets of alienated white voters and tax revolters. The reaction to his Great Society and to broader trends helped spawn a dramatic political polarization in the United States that some historians have labeled a conservative counter-revolution. Further clouding Johnson's legacy was the devastating outcome of the Vietnam War. While his programs kept untold numbers of Americans out of poverty, gave others basic health care, and ensured the fundamental rights of citizenship for minorities, in Southeast Asia, millions of Vietnamese lost their lives and homes, more than 58,000 American military personnel lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands more would have their lives permanently altered. At a time when Americans were reshaping the locus of power at home, events in Vietnam were raising serious questions about how America should use its clout abroad. The legacies of death, renewal, and opportunity attached to the Johnson administration are ironic, confusing, and uncertain. They will likely remain that way. According to biographer Randall Woods, Johnson posed in many different roles. Johnson the son of the tenant farmer, Johnson the great compromiser, Johnson the all-knowing, Johnson the humble, Johnson the warrior, Johnson the dove, Johnson the romantic, Johnson the hard-headed pragmatist, Johnson the preserver of traditions, Johnson the crusader for social justice, Johnson the magnanimous, Johnson the vindictive or Johnson the uncouth, LBJ the hick, Lyndon the satyr, and Johnson the usurper. Johnson had his particular brand of persuasion, known as the Johnson treatment. There was no more powerful majority leader in American history, biographer Robert Dallek writes. Dallek stated that Johnson had biographies on all the senators, knew what their ambitions, hopes, and tastes were and used it to his advantage in securing votes. Another Johnson biographer noted, he could get up every day and learn what their fears, their desires, their wishes, their wants were, and he could then manipulate, dominate, persuade, and cajole them. As president, Johnson vetoed 30 bills. No other president in history vetoed so many bills and never had a single one overridden by Congress. He was often seen as an ambitious, tireless, and imposing figure who was ruthlessly effective at getting legislation passed. He typically worked 18 to 20-hour days without a break and had no regular leisure activities. He stood 6 feet 3.5 inches, 1.918 m, tall. Johnson's cowboy hat and boots reflected his Texas roots and love of the rural hill country. From 250 acres, 100 ha, of land that he was given by an aunt in 1951, he created a 2,700-acre, 1,100 ha, working ranch with 400 cattle. The National Park Service keeps a herd descended from Johnson's and maintains the ranch property. Biographer Randall Woods argues that social gospel themes Johnson learned from childhood allowed him to transform social problems into moral problems. This helps explain his longtime commitment to social justice, and explicitly inspired his foreign policy approach to Christian internationalism and nation building. For example, in a 1966 speech he quoted at length from the social creed of the Methodist Church, adding, "It would be very hard for me to write a more perfect description of the American ideal." Legacy. Scholars have viewed Johnson through the lens of both his legislative achievements and his lack of success in the Vietnam War. His overall rating among historians has remained relatively steady, and his average ranking is higher than any of the 8 presidents who followed him, although similar to Reagan and Clinton. In public polling of presidential favorability of Johnson and the presidents who succeeded him, Johnson tends to appear more toward the bottom of lists, typically accepting George W. Bush and Richard Nixon, and sometimes Gerald Ford. Historian Kent Germany explains, "The man who was elected to the White House by one of the widest margins in U.S. history and pushed through as much legislation as any other American politician now seems to be remembered best by the public for succeeding an assassinated hero, steering the country into a quagmire in Vietnam, cheating on his saintly wife, exposing his stitched-up belly, using profanity, picking up dogs by their ears, swimming naked with advisors in the White House pool, and emptying his bowels while conducting official business." Of all those issues, Johnson's reputation suffers the most from his management of the Vietnam War, something that has overshadowed his civil rights and domestic policy accomplishments and caused Johnson himself to regret his handling of "The Woman I Really Loved." The Great Society. The Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston was renamed the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in 1973, and the United States Department of Education headquarters was named after Johnson in 2007. The Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin was named in his honor, as is the Lyndon B. Johnson National Grassland. Also named for him are schools in Austin and Laredo, Texas, Melbourne, Florida, and Jackson, Kentucky. Interstate 635 in Dallas is named the Lyndon B. Johnson Freeway. The Lyndon Baines Johnson Memorial Grove on the Potomac was dedicated in 1976. Johnson was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 1980. Texas created a state holiday on August 27 to mark Johnson's birthday, known as Lyndon Baines Johnson Day. Major legislation signed. 1963, Clean Air Act. 1963, Higher Education Facilities Act. 1963, Vocational Education Act. 1964, Civil Rights Act. 1964, Urban Mass Transportation Act. 1964, Wilderness Act. 1964, Nurse Training Act. 1964, Food Stamp Act. 1964, Economic Opportunity Act. 1964, Housing Act. 1965, Higher Education Act. 1965, Older Americans Act. 1965, Coinage Act. 1965, Social Security Act. 1965, Voting Rights Act. 1965, Immigration and Nationality Services Act. 1966, Animal Welfare Act. 1966, Freedom of Information Act. 1967, Age Discrimination in Employment Act. 1967, Public Broadcasting Act. 1968, Architectural Barriers Act. 1968, Bilingual Education Act. 1968, Civil Rights Act. 1968, Gun Control Act. Significant regulatory changes. 1968, FCC creates National Emergency No. 9-1-1. Lyndon Baines Johnson was one of the most astute, effective, and perplexing politicians in modern American history. An accidental president but a master legislator, he was determined to out-Kennedy the Kennedys by pushing through historic social legislation on a scale that rivaled FDR's New Deal. A Southerner who championed civil rights, LBJ put into motion many of the programs that would continue to shape American life throughout the 1960s and 1970s, a package of reforms known as the Great Society. but as his authority was undermined by an increasingly unpopular commitment of U.S. forces to Vietnam, his presidency began to unravel. Opposition to the war spurred protest movements and a youthful counterculture. In 1968 he stunned the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. A larger-than-life figure in his day, LBJ is appreciated for his vast domestic accomplishments, but his presidency continues to be overshadowed by his failure to end the war in Vietnam. Thank you for watching this video.